1973. I let you just wind back there. I know only a handful of you can remember 1973. 1973, Richard Nixon was the President of the United States. 1973, the Vietnam War, as far as the United States, ended hostilities there. At a later point in that year, we ceased bombing Cambodia. I don't know why the two didn't go hand in hand, but they both happened in that year. In 1973, the Oakland Athletics won the World Series. In 1973, the Miami Dolphins won the Super Bowl after an undefeated season. Is this starting to ring a bell now? Is this starting to sound familiar to you? Okay, 1973 was a big year. Anybody remember what the #1 song was that year? I guess not. Me and Mrs. Jones. I know you all knew that. In 1973, the Supreme Court of the United States handed down a decision that we know today as Roe versus Wade. I don't know how much of the background to that you know, but this decision came about because a woman in Texas by the name of Norma McCovey, a lady in Texas, found out that she had become pregnant and did not want to carry this child to term. In 1973, abortion was largely illegal in almost every state in the United States. If in the case of an attack, if you became pregnant as a result of an attack, or pregnant as a result of an improper relationship, it was legal to go and have that baby terminated. When Miss McCovey went to the only facility that was nearby her home to perform this abortion, she found out that it had been closed by the police. The sheriff had come and closed it in that county. And so she sued the local district attorney by the name of Henry Wade. This case made its way through the Texas courts, through the state courts, the appellate courts, and onward up to the Supreme Court. Now you're wondering where the name Roe comes from. Roe is an alias. The case was filed on behalf of Henry Wade and an alias, Jane Roe. The reason that the alias was used is because Miss McCovey no longer wanted her name associated with this because she didn't want to find out that she was going to lie about the case. She was going to lie and say that the pregnancy had come about as a result of an attack in order to bypass the law. So we come to this point. The case is heard in 1972 into 73, and the court came to the decision that enshrined in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution that the right to privacy made it possible made it so that any communication between a physician and their patient, the right of privacy would be abridged if the ability to abort or terminate that pregnancy was removed. So it became one of those human rights alongside the unalienable rights that we talked about last week. We talked about in the beginning of the Constitution where it says all men are created equal and they have certain unalienable rights, that is, rights that cannot be removed or abridged by human legislation. These rights are unalienable. They are given to people by God. They are granted not by law, not by legislators. They are granted by God. And among these, of course, the ones we know the best, life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. So the court said this private act between a physician and his patient was one of those unalienable rights granted by God that could not be abridged by law. And since that date, in 1973, when this was passed into law, it has been challenged over and over and over and over, and still they go back to this right of privacy in that amendment to preserve the ability to terminate a pregnancy. About 3 years after that happens, the Hyde Amendment, which is an amendment to national law, which says that no public funds, none of your tax dollars are to go and be devoted to the termination of pregnancy. And so this amendment rides on the budget year after year after. When we pass a budget, it rides on that budget year after year. And it is supposed to present or prevent the ability of tax dollars to be given directly to the act of terminating the pregnancy. Now, we know for a fact that this doesn't work because money is filtered through this and that avenue in order to arrive at its final location, but this is the law. Every year when this amendment is argued over, one of the major parties will argue in favor of it. They will argue in favor of maintaining the amendment and the importance of keeping it in place. And one of the major parties will argue that it must be removed because it is unfair for the legislators to prevent an unalienable right to be removed from one of the citizens of the United States. So back and forth this goes, back and forth. It is argued, it is won, it is lost. It goes back and forth and back and forth. Somebody from one of the parties or one of the organizations that supports the repeal of the Hyde Amendment said this about this human right. Likewise, the head of a Texas-based abortion group said in a press release, Hyde hurts our clients and their families because it forces them to pay out of pocket for a procedure that should be recognized by our government as not only a basic human right, but a basic form of medical care that all Texans of all socioeconomic backgrounds depend on. So I don't know where you stand on this issue, but wherever you stand on this particular issue, whether in favor or against the Hyde Amendment, whether you see this right to privacy or this right to terminate the pregnancy in the 14th Amendment, on either side, here's the reality of our election process. One of the parties, whether those who stand against it or whether those who are in favor of it, is going to win the election about 30 days from now, right? About a month from now, one of the two parties there. And so we as Christians, we have a responsibility to vote. We have a responsibility to vote on more than whether there is a D or an R behind the candidate's name. We have a responsibility to look into what the party supports, what that candidate supports as far as their party is concerned, and which of the parties will best represent the human rights of all people. All people, whether they be unborn, whether they be middle-aged, or whether they be nearing the terminal end of their life. Because here's the slope that this kind of legislation goes on. If it's allowed at one end, it will be allowed at the other end. Now, and you may agree with that. You may say, yeah, just like we allow it over here, it should be allowed over here. Again, I don't know where you stand, but understand that this choice leads to this choice, which will lead to this choice, which will lead to this choice. The choices that we make as far as voting is concerned, especially when we pick a leader, one who will stand at the head of a particular party, we have to make that choice more on whether they, or less on whether they have, that particular letter at the end of the name, and more on whether or not all lives will matter under the presidency of that person. Now, I don't bring this up because I want to get onto a hobby horse about this or that particular topic. I bring it up because, again, as we open Amos and we look at what God set Israel apart for judgment for, we find that in every case, every complaint that he had against the nation of Israel, his elect people, every complaint that he had, every reason for his judgment has to do with their unwillingness to value the image of God in all people. If you remember the list of complaints that started out, he started out talking about the neighbors of Israel, those who would be seen as the enemies of Israel. And he said, well, they treat people like objects. They enslave people. They don't value other human beings, and on around the circle there. And remember, he brought that back and he said, oh, and Judah, you are equally responsible. Oh, and Israel, you are the most responsible of all people. And so while God is going to judge all of the neighboring nations, he brings it right back to his people. And he says, you are the most responsible of all for not treating the poor correctly, for not seeing the image of God in human beings, for not valuing the lives of all people. You, Israel, are most culpable because you were set here to be the example. You were called to be my people so that your neighbors would see something different. You were called to be my people. You are my elect people, my beloved people. And you are supposed to be setting the example for everyone around you. And not only have you not set the example, you have set a negative example before them. And they have gladly followed that. And so Israel was caught by surprise by the fact that God had called them about. They were certainly celebrating when they heard that their neighbors were going to be judged. They were certainly pleased as punch to find out that even their southern neighbor, Judah, was going to be judged. But when God came around to them and Amos said, oh, and by the way, Israel, you're going to be judged as well, I'm certain they were caught completely by surprise. They were caught by surprise because they were outstanding worshipers. They were expert worshipers. If you had to bring X number of pigeons to sacrifice, they brought exactly X number of pigeons to sacrifice. If they were told that on the Sabbath day they could only walk their donkey 50 feet, they would go 49 3/4 of a foot just to be sure. They could follow the letter of the law better than anybody. And yet there was nothing in their heart. It meant absolutely nothing to them. They were just going through the motions. They were just acting like the people of God. And they took for granted, because God had named them as his select people, because God had saved them and brought them out of bondage, because God had led them across the desert, because God had given them the land, they took completely for granted their responsibility to the covenant. They held up their going to heaven ticket and said, well, see, we're okay. We've got our ticket punched. And God says your ticket doesn't mean anything because you're not upholding the covenant. As you remember, you and I, Israel, you and I made a covenant agreement We made an agreement. I would be your God. You would be my people. And these were the conditions of that covenant. You would be my ambassadors and my example. I would demonstrate what it means to be a nation of people blessed by God. And you, Israel, have not lived up to your side of the argument. He starts in verse 3 or chapter 3. He says, "Hear this word, people of Israel. The word of the Lord has spoken against you and against the whole family I brought up out of Egypt. You only have I chosen of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will punish you for all your sins." He says, "Do two walk together unless they have agreed to do so?" So the first thing God says is, we had an agreement. You and I, we had a covenant agreement between us. I elected you who had nothing going for you. I selected you, not the biggest nation in all of the world. You were the smallest people in all the world. You were the weakest people. You had the least going for you. And I, God, selected you to be my people. And you agreed to be my people. You know, when Amos says, "Do two walk together unless they have agreed to do so?" Picture this, what God is saying. You're walking along, having a nice walk down by the lake somewhere, all by yourself, lost in your thoughts, and somebody walks up right next to you and starts walking with you, looking at you. That'd be kind of weird, wouldn't it? I know. No, you would never do that. You'd can I help you? Or you'd walk a little faster, a little slower, because you didn't agree to walk together. But God says it didn't go like that. God says, I didn't sneak up on you one night and go, I'm your God now. And you didn't somehow have a special election in the middle of the night and say, yeah, that God is okay. Yahweh, he's going to be our God. No, none of that. He says, we had a covenant agreement between the two of us, you and I, and you broke it. Now, I'm sure they didn't want to hear anything else at this point. I'm sure that once they heard that their name was listed among those nations that were going to be judged, that was it. They didn't want to hear anything else. But Amos had a lot to say to them. He runs through these series of comparisons. Does a lion roar in the thicket when it has no prey? Does it growl in its den when it has caught nothing? The answer, no. No, that's true. You're right. Does a bird swoop down to a trap on the ground when no bait is there? No. When a trumpet sounds in a city, do the people not tremble? No. Surely God has done nothing without revealing his plans. So this is where it starts to cut into them. Because it's not as though this is a surprise. It's not like this is the first time that they're finding out that their behavior is not acceptable as far as the covenant is concerned. What Amos is saying is, listen, I'm not the first prophet that has come to you. I could tick off a whole list of prophets that came before me, and every single one of them warned you. Every single one of them told you, get back in line. Get back right with the covenant. God is giving you this opportunity to come back. God is giving you one more opportunity. So prophet after prophet after prophet comes to them. And did they listen? No. They get worse and worse and worse because they took God for granted. They took the fact that they were members of this covenant agreement as though God would never turn on them. That no matter what they did, no matter how they voted, no matter how they behaved, no matter what they did, no matter how well they worshiped, whether they worshiped or not, it didn't matter. They said, we got the covenant card. We're God's guys, and we're okay. And God will never turn against us. And now they can't almost believe it, that God is turning against them. That God is looking at them and saying, no more. No more. In fact, God has Amos go another step further. If they have not gotten it to this point, God says, go get some witnesses. It doesn't have to be my word. Go get the neighbors from around Israel here. And let's hear about Israel's behavior. Let's hear about how they've kept the covenant. Let's hear about the quality of their life. And so Amos brings in witnesses from the neighborhood. Hey, what's his life like? What's their life like? Well, let me tell you. Let me tell you exactly what their life is like. We learned how to behave from watching them. We confirmed that our behavior was okay by watching God's people. We acted this way. We didn't value any human lives. We didn't value anything except ourselves. And we looked at Israel and they were doing the same thing, so it must have been okay. So these witnesses that are brought in against Israel, God's saying, you're responsible for their behavior. You showed them how to behave. You showed them that you, the blessed people of God, could act any way that you want. And so your neighbors took that and ran with it. And they didn't even know God. They just continued to debase themselves. They continued to live their lives of outright rebellion. And they were going to be judged. And so was Israel. And I bet that's what it sounded like. Nobody could argue. Nobody could jump up and say, no way, you got this wrong. Nobody could say, We've absolutely been locked in on the covenant. And none of that. Nobody could say a word to what God had brought to them. God had sent prophet after prophet to say, you're breaking the covenant. God had brought their neighbors as witnesses against them to say, yep, they're breaking the covenant, and we learned how to be rebellious from watching them. So God says, judgment's coming. Judgment is coming your way because of how you have lived your lives. And he tells them, he gives them all the details of the judgment that's coming their way. But listen to this in verse 12. Well, start in verse 11. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. An enemy will overrun your land, pull down your strongholds, and plunder your fortresses. This is what the Lord says. As a shepherd rescues from the lion's mouth only 2 leg bones or a piece of an ear, so will the Israelites living in Samaria be rescued with only the head of a bed and a piece of fabric from a couch. That sounds weird to us. Actually, it sounds kind of gory to us. If you were a shepherd in that time and you were responsible for X sheep, if a lion or a bear some other vicious animal came up and stole one of your sheep, you had to retrieve whatever you could retrieve to take back to the owner of those sheep and say, look, I told you a bear got this thing, and here's the leg bone, or a piece of an ear, I think was the other. Here it is. And God's saying, you're going to be destroyed. You're going to be wiped out, but I'm going to save some of you. I'm going to save a small remnant of you. A few of you are going to survive, and still it's not going to be pretty. Those few that survive are not going to be, the glory of all Israel. You are not going to be the glory of the reunited Judah and Israel. It's going to be a very small, tiny, almost insignificant remnant. It's going to look like the scrap of a couch or the arm of a chair. That's all that people are going to see. So this judgment that's coming your way, because you refuse to acknowledge God, because you refuse to acknowledge and live out your part of the covenant, because you refuse to value human lives, the judgment that's going to come on you is going to end you. It's really going to be the end of this. And yet God, who owns the sheep, he is both the shepherd and the owner of the sheep. He is going to pluck that little bit out of the mouth of the encroaching lion. And he's going to save it. He's going to say, see, these are my people. That's pretty tough. That's pretty tough. That's almost unbelievable that God would take his people, his elect people, people that were known by his name, that were freed from their slavery, that were carried by his gentle hand across the desert, that were given the law, that were given the ability and the means to worship him, that were blessed by him with a land, that these people would be judged and ended with this one tiny bit of hope. That God would not say, my people are going to vanish from the world, but most everybody's going to pay the price for the behavior of all. Not really a happy book, really a challenging book, because nothing has changed. You and I have a covenant agreement with God through Jesus Christ. Believe in my Son, and you shall be saved. Believe in my Son who died for you. Believe in my Son who shed his blood and had his bones broken and his life expired so that you could live. Believe in that. As you believe in that, my Spirit, the fullness of God, will come and take up residence within you. When that Spirit of God comes and takes up residence within you, you will have an ability that you never had before. You will be holy. You will be set apart. You will be able to actually worship God. You will have the privilege of prayer. You will have the privilege of God dwelling within you to guide your life. You will have all these things so long as you maintain that covenant. You must believe. When you read believe in the Bible, we read it in English. We read it as this terminal verb, like one time you have to believe. So just believe at some second in your life, and then everything's good after that. But that's not what that word is. That word, when you get your Greek Bible out and you read that, to believe means you must believe and keep believing and continue to believe and never cease to believe. That's your part of the covenant. Our part of the covenant is to believe and keep believing and keep believing and be transformed. That as that Spirit lives within us and we keep believing, we allow that Spirit to transform us. And why? For the same reason that Israel was set apart. You and I are transformed not so that we can be super duper human beings. We are transformed by the work of that Spirit within us so that when our neighbors are called to witness against us, they will say good and positive things. They will say that my Christian neighbors show me love no matter what I do. They will say that my Christian neighbors, my Christian teacher, my Christian insurance aide, whatever it is, my Christian people that are in my life demonstrate what it means for God to be blessing them. I see something different in them. I see that God actually exists in their life. I see that God, not themselves, are the priority in their life. I see that, yes, they live and walk and talk and act and do everything differently only because God is within them. That's our covenant with God. So when God says, you are now my son, you are now my daughter, you are now my children, And you and I are in this covenant now, and I've taken up dwelling within you the expectation of holiness, the expectation of us to be able to look at other people and see in every person the image of God. Whether that image be right out here on their face, whether that image be buried under years and years of muck and rebellion and filth and whatever it is, the image of God dwells in every human being on this planet. And in our covenant agreement with God, we will not look at people as objects. We will not look at people as something we can take advantage of. We will not look at people as something that is disposable, whether they are unborn or whether they are at the terminal end of their life and they're just taking up space. We will never cease to look at people and not recognize the image of God within them. How's that for a deal? That's your agreement with God. You have agreed because of what He did on your behalf. And remember, there was nothing you could do. You and I, powerless to overcome that gap of sin. No matter how hard we try, no matter how many works we do, no matter how many things we do, even if we lift our hands up to a really good song, the only thing that bridges the gap of sin is Christ. That's it. And when we accept that covenant agreement, yes, I believe and I accept your grace and I want to live for you, then we actually have to do that. We actually have to live for God. Remember, Israel is being called out for just doing this. Oh yeah, we're God's people. Doing whatever they wanted to do, taking advantage of whoever they wanted to take advantage of, living however they wanted to do. Oh, but we're God's people. God must have been doing this with His hand, like, oh, not again. Right? You've read some of the Old Testament. You've probably read it all. Where does God says, I've had it. Stop with your celebrations. Stop with your worship. Stop bringing me cows. Stop bringing me everything, because all you're doing is saying the words. You don't mean it. And the same covenant applies to us. We cannot just say that we are Christians. We cannot just say that we are Christ followers. We cannot just say that we love God and we love Jesus. We actually have to do it. We actually have to do it, and we have to live our lives according to that love. And it's not something you have to force yourself to do. It's not something that you have to practice. It's not something that I have to teach you how to do. All you have to do is look at that. That's all you have to do. Look at that and say, Jesus died for me. Insert your name there. Jesus died so that I could live. And then proceed from there. That's what God expects of you and I. That is His covenant agreement with us in the new covenant. And yes, grace plays an enormous part in that, but grace has its limits. You cannot say I'm a Christian. You cannot say I believe. You cannot say that I go to church and not live out the rest of the covenant. And now you're saying, what does this have to do with the election that you brought up earlier? It has everything to do with it. We have agreed already, I think for 3 or 4 weeks, however long we've been doing this, none of the candidates is ideal. None of the candidates is barely this far off the floor. They're all dragging each other through the gutter. They've all lived their lives in the gutter. They've all got this agenda or that agenda. And so it's tempting for us to say, well, you know what? I'm God's guy. I'm God's woman. He loves me, so I'm just going to back out of this. I heard a lot of that over the past few days. I'm just not going to vote. I'm just not going to have anything to do. You don't have that option. God has made you a part of this country. God has made you a part of this community of people. And so you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice between which of the candidates will most preserve justice for people, which of the candidates will be less likely to preserve justice for the people. Which of the candidates is going to make it most likely that they will see some glimmer of the image of God in all human beings, unborn to the aged? And which of the candidates will be less likely to see the image of God and to preserve that image? Which of the candidates is going to be more likely to preserve your liberty, and which of the candidates is going to be less likely to preserve your liberty? We think that as God's people, and with God watching over us, and with God's hand upon our church, and all these things, that the government will never interfere with what we do. That we're somehow special and set apart. So the government will never come in and say, oh, you can't sing that song anymore. I forget that. They'll let us sing whatever songs we want. You can never say ABC anymore. You say, come on, Pastor, that'll never happen. You see it happening all the time. We'll never be told that we have to perform certain kinds of marriages. We'll never be told that certain things can't be published or said by us. We'll never be told that we can't pray in public. We'll never be told that we can't go over to the school and grab a bunch of students and lead them out and pray with them. We'll never be told any of these things except we will. We'll never be told that, the image of God only exists in people from 1 day old until, I don't know, how old are you, Bob? Until you're 60, right? And then after 60, the image of God somehow, I'm just guessing, okay? That somehow the image of God will vanish. I still love you. Okay, forget I said 60. Bob, you're 45, okay? So after 45, you know what I mean? That before this date and after this date, human life has zero value. Has no value whatsoever, so it's just, let's get rid of it. You say, Pastor, that would never happen, but it did. It's already happened. It's already happened. I think I told you that story about 15 minutes ago. We have a difficult choice to make. And fortunately, God's Word has given us the benefit of seeing what poor choices in the past have resulted in. The Bible gives us a crystal clear picture of what happens when a people who are God's people take for granted their part of the covenant. They take for granted the grace that has been extended to them. They take for granted the ability to worship. They take for granted the privilege of prayer. They take all these things for granted and say, come on, God will never judge us. God will never take away our ability to say these things happen in our body, these things don't happen. But history has shown that God will say, you and I made a covenant. You and I agreed to walk together. And now you don't want to walk with me anymore. Now you want to go your own way. Now you want it to be your way. Now you want it to be you being the most important thing. our covenant is broken. We have to choose beyond D's and R's and I's and L's and C's and whatever other letter appears on our ballot here in a few weeks. We have to, especially this year, look beyond that kind of blind loyalty. We have to look beyond that and see what God values. And we have to be willing to stand up for God's values. If we do that, if we stand up, and not just us, but if all Christians will stand up and say, of the bad choices that we have, this is the least bad choice. This is the one that will lead us to be most likely to be able to live out our part of the covenant. We will demonstrate a lot of things. We will demonstrate that we value God's image in all people, unborn to the aged. We will demonstrate that we value God's image in our neighborhood and our friends and our neighbors. We will even demonstrate to the world that we value God's image in people even when they are in open rebellion against God. We will see the image of God in all people. We will demonstrate to a world that is watching us, that may be called as witnesses against us one day, we will demonstrate exactly what it means to have God's image within. And if we do that and we look at this little bit of hope here, we will demonstrate to the world. We will demonstrate first to the United States and then to all the world what it means to be human. You see, we have the fullness of humanity only by the grace of God. We have the ability to be fully human. And to be fully human, I know you have to go back to the very first chapters of the Bible. But what it means to be fully human is to be in perfect communion with God. To be holy, so that God can be in your presence and you can be in His presence. That's what it means to be human. Not just the fact that our hearts are beating and blood is coursing through our veins. To be fully human means to be in communion with God. We have a difficult choice to make. It won't be any easier over the next few weeks, but we can ask ourselves one more question. By voting for this person, or this person, or this person, will I show the world that I am more human or less human? Amen.